Hello, future doctors. Welcome back to GCSE Best Medicine's AQA Biology lecture series. In this lesson, we'll be talking about hormonal coordination, which is driven by the endocrine system. The endocrine system, if you recall, is a system of glands which produces hormones. If this is a gland and it's producing some hormones, these hormones then travel by blood. So for example, this hormone is going to go into the blood over to distant tissues. So here's a target organ, and it's going to go through blood to target organs. That is the endocrine system. There's also two other kinds of pathways for cellular signaling molecules to travel, and that is paracrine signaling. Paracrine signaling is essentially just diffusion from one cell to another. So you have a cell, and then this is producing some things, and those molecules are simply diffusing to the next cell. Okay? That's paracrine. There's also something called autocrine. Autocrine is that the cell produces some molecules, okay? And then these molecules go ahead and bind to cell itself. That is autocrine. But endocrine is when you have blood involved. You're producing secretions that are going into the blood vessels, and from the blood vessels, they're going to affect our organs. Okay? That is endocrine. Paracrine and autocrine are not in your syllabus, but endocrine is. Now, the different types of glands that exist and are included in your syllabus include the pituitary gland. Do you remember where the pituitary gland is situated? It is present in the brain, right? Inside the skull. So around here, you would have the pituitary gland, and the secretions that the pituitary gland secretes, the hormones that it makes are, number one, antidiuretic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, ADH, FSH, LH, TSH. Also makes growth hormone, which is involved in the puberty growth spurt. A little bit of a background to these hormones. Antidiuretic hormone, diuresis, essentially where this word comes from, antidiuretic. Diuresis means to be able to produce a lot of urine, to have a lot of water in the urine. So ADH, antidiuretic hormone, would then, as a result, produce lesser urine, lesser water in the urine, more water in the blood. Okay? Follicle stimulating hormone stimulates follicle development in the ovaries. So this is going to go ahead and target the ovaries. LH, luteinizing hormone. This causes something called ovulation. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, goes and stimulates the thyroid to release thyroid hormone. And growth hormone helps in growth. Now, the pituitary gland is also known as the master gland of the body. And do you know why that is? That is because it is producing these secretions like FSH and LH and TSH, and there's also something called ACTH, not part of AQA, but it also goes ahead and stimulates the adrenals. So you have many of these hormones that are stimulating other glands, right? TSH stimulating the thyroid gland, ACTH stimulating the adrenal glands, FSH, LH stimulating the ovaries. So you have all of these hormones that are stimulating other glands. Therefore, the pituitary is known as the master gland. Okay, next up we have the thyroid. The thyroid gland produces thyroid hormone. We also call it thyroxine. Thyroid hormone helps increase the body's rate of metabolism, rate of respiration, rate of heart rate, rate of burning of calories, right? Respiration, essentially. Then we have the adrenal gland. So the thyroid gland is situated right in the neck in front of the thyroid cartilage, okay? Right here. Adrenal glands. Adrenal glands are present just above the kidneys. And I think you guys are almost aware that the adrenal glands, they produce adrenaline, right? And do you remember when adrenaline is produced? It is produced when we are in situations of stress, of fight or flight. Another hormone, another stress hormone that adrenal glands produce is called cortisol. Okay, cortisol. That is also a stress hormone. The endocrine system also includes pancreas. Pancreas controls blood sugar with insulin and glucagon. Pancreas is very important because it produces insulin. And do you remember what insulin does? It lowers the blood sugar level. So here is the pancreas, right here, and this is going to produce insulin, which is going to decrease blood sugar, and glucagon, which is going to increase blood sugar. Then we have the ovaries and the testes. So let's have a look at ovaries. This is a male reproductive diagram, but ovaries should be present around. If I were to draw a female reproductive system on top of this, here are the ovaries. Okay, so these are the ovaries, and ovaries produce estrogen, which is the female secondary sexual characteristic developmental hormone, and it also thickens the endometrial lining. So we'll talk more about this later in its own chapter, or in its own section. Number 2, we have progesterone. Progesterone maintains the uterine lining, maintains the inner wall of the uterus. Estrogen develops the inner wall of the uterus, while progesterone maintains the inner wall of the uterus. So we'll talk more about how all of that pans out in a bit. Then we have the testes. The testes in males, they produce something called testosterone, okay? And testosterone is responsible for the male secondary sexual characteristic development, okay? Just like estrogen is responsible for female sexual characteristics, testosterone is responsible for male secondary sexual characteristics. So testes are going to produce testosterone, as the name suggests. Okay, and there we have it, the endocrine system. So the endocrine system consists of a network of glands that are connected by blood vessels. So each of these glands, right, is supplied by blood vessels, and then those blood vessels run throughout the body, right, into the arms and legs and all the other organs, and they take hormones to their different target organs. So that is the endocrine system. Now, jumping into the details of the glands, we're going to talk about the pituitary gland firstly. So let's have a look at the pituitary. The pituitary gland is situated below the hypothalamus inside the skull. Remember the hypothalamus? The hypothalamus should be around here, right? And then over here we have the pituitary. The pituitary produces FSH, LH, ADH, TSH, and growth hormone, right? The pituitary gland is also known as the master gland of the body because it controls secretions of many other glands. For example, controlling the secretions of the ovaries, controlling the secretions of the adrenal glands, controlling the secretion of thyroid gland, and so on. So, firstly, let's have a look at FSH. What is that? How does it work? Well, it says that it produces FSH, follicle-stimulating hormone, which stimulates the ovaries to develop follicles. What are follicles? Let's have a look, okay? So remember that in the brain, right, here's the brain, and then in the brain we have the pituitary gland, the pons and medulla and so on. In the brain we have the pituitary gland, and then it produces something called FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. Well, this is going to go ahead and travel by blood to the ovaries. Okay, so there would be a blood vessel that's going to take it through the blood eventually to the ovaries. Where are the ovaries situated? The ovaries are situated in the female reproductive tract, one on each side connected to the oviduct, to the fallopian tube. Okay, so if this is the uterus, let me show you. This is the uterus, and this right here is called the fallopian tube. Now this connects the ovaries, which are here, to the uterus. The ovaries contain something very special. They contain egg cells, okay? Inside the ovaries there are egg cells. Remember egg cells in meiosis and fertilization? Ovum? These are the egg cells that are going to go ahead and take part in fertilization. So before these are released into the fallopian tube so that sperm can fertilize them, they need to be developed in surrounded by something called a follicle. So a follicle essentially is just a group of cells and a little bit of fluid that is going to surround a cell once every cycle. So remember, follicle stimulating hormone is coming in, right? FSH is coming in, and what it does is that it chooses or causes one of the cells to start developing a follicle around it. So what's going to happen here is that there would be a little bit of a tissue that starts developing around an egg, okay? And then over time, it is going to become bigger and bigger. So now it's becoming a bit bigger, okay, and the egg is still inside of it, and then it becomes very, very big and a completely mature follicle, okay? So this is quite big now, and this is called a mature follicle. So once the follicle is mature, now what's going to happen is LH, luteinizing hormone, is going to come in, okay? Now, follicle development usually starts around day 1 of the female menstrual cycle, and approximately on day 14 of a normal 28-day menstrual cycle, LH surge comes in. So LH is just a guy who shows up, when the party's already ready. Or a lot like me, who shows up when the dinner is ready, right? So LH only shows up when the follicle's ready and ready to rupture, and then it shows up and does its thing and then leaves. Okay, LH has no other role. What it does is that LH is gonna come in, right, and it's gonna cause this follicle to rupture. So once this follicle ruptures, so here's the follicle now, it has ruptured, and it has become this weird shape now, and it has released the egg into the fallopian tube. It has released the egg into the fallopian tube. So that is the function of LH, to cause the follicle to rupture, releasing the egg into the fallopian tube. This egg now is going to start moving along, eventually reaching the sperm. So egg is going to glide along, probably here, and then here probably a sperm will come in and fertilize the egg. And once this egg is fertilized, then you would get a zygote, right? So here's a zygote, and then this zygote eventually will become bigger and be implanted in the uterus. So LH's function here is to rupture the follicle, and that is called, it has a name, right? That is called ovulation, okay? Ovulation. So shortly after ovulation, fertility has the greatest chance, because now the egg is inside the fallopian tube, ready to be fertilized, okay? So just to repeat this, we have the follicle stimulating hormone, which stimulates ovaries to develop follicles, which contains eggs. Now every menstrual cycle, one of these eggs will be released into the fallopian tube in hopes of fertilization, okay? LH is the guy who only shows up to the party when it's already already going on and already at its peak. So when the follicle is mature, then LH is released. This causes a rupture of the follicle. When the follicle ruptures, it's going to release the egg into the fallopian tube. This is called ovulation, and this is a very important term, okay? You have to remember that this is called ovulation. This occurs approximately on day 14 of a 28-day menstrual cycle, okay? Let me tell you something extra here, which we'll discuss later in its own section as well. But essentially, this part here, the ruptured follicle, right? That's not a waste. When the follicle ruptures, it becomes a structure called corpus luteum, okay? Corpus, L-U-T-E-U-M, corpus luteum. So the ruptured follicle, the remains of the follicle after ovulation becomes corpus luteum. Now we'll talk more about corpus luteum in its own section, okay? And these are the functions of FSH and LH. What about ADH? What about ADH? ADH stands for anti-diuretic hormone. Diuresis means producing urine, having a lot of water in the urine. Anti-diuretic, therefore, means conserving water. You don't want too much water to go into the urine from the blood. So the blood should have more water. That's what ADH is going to do. Now here's what occurs. Essentially, remember the hypothalamus? So here's the hypothalamus in the brain, and then situated just below it, you've got the pituitary. The hypothalamus is supplied by blood vessels, right? And then they contain blood, and hypothalamus contains osmoreceptors, okay? Osmoreceptors. So it is consistently monitoring the concentration of the blood, the water content of the blood. If there is less concentration, less water level in the blood, then hypothalamus stimulates the pituitary to release ADH. When ADH is released, it's going to go into the kidneys. So let's have a look at a kidney. Let's make a kidney here. So a kidney looks kind of like this, right? And then the kidney essentially is making urine, right? So let's say this is urine, let's say. Now here's what ADH does. ADH goes and tells the kidney, I need my water back, right? Bring me my water back. Take it out of the urine, back into the blood. So that's what the kidney does. It obliges because it's a good guy, right? It's going to listen to ADH and it's going to say, okay, as you say, sir, I'm going to take the water back out of the urine, back into the blood vessels. So what the kidney will do as a response is that it's going to take the water out of the urine back into the blood. So water is going to go back into the blood. Reabsorption of water from the urine back into the blood. And this is done by a part of the kidney called the collecting tubules, okay? The collecting tubules is a part of the kidney that responds to ADH's instructions and reabsorbs the water back from the urine into the blood, okay? Collecting tubules. So we'll draw a diagram of collecting tubules in its own section, and we'll talk more about this in detail again in its own section. Another hormone that the pituitary gland produces is ACTH. Now I've added this is not part of AQA. You don't need to know ACTH itself, but it is important for our understanding of pituitary function as the master gland. So ACTH is a hormone that is produced by the pituitary gland, and it's going to go to the adrenal glands. Remember the adrenal glands? Those are present on top of the kidneys. So ACTH goes to the adrenal glands and tells them, I want cortisol. I want cortisol. I want cortisol. So ACTH is the I want cortisol hormone released by the pituitary gland. What is cortisol? Cortisol is a stress hormone. It is released to increase blood sugar. Remember, increasing blood sugar would facilitate aerobic respiration, even anaerobic respiration. It would increase the metabolism, especially rate of respiration, and it also decreases inflammation. So that is cortisol. Now, for the sake of AQA, you don't need to know ACTH, but you do need to know what cortisol is and what it does, where it's released from, and what does it do, okay? And next up, we have TSH. TSH is the thyroid stimulating hormone. What it does essentially is it travels by the blood to the thyroid gland in the neck and stimulates it to release thyroid hormone. Okay? Thyroid hormone is also called thyroxine, usually in AQA. However, there's two types, T3 and T4. T3 is called triiodothyronine and T4 is called thyroxine. But in your mark schemes, they use the word thyroid hormone and thyroxine. So you should use these two words in your answers, okay? Okay, so next up we have the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is situated just below the Adam's apple, right? The thyroid cartilage in the neck. So if this is the Adam's apple, just below it, you have the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland produces thyroxine, or thyroid hormone. What does the thyroid hormone do? Essentially what it does is that it increases metabolic rate, increases rate of respiration, increases heart rate, increases sweating, and also increases body heat production, right? So it increases essentially the rate of burning of calories and energy making. So how does this relationship with the pituitary gland pan out? Well, the way it works is that the brain is able to detect decreased thyroid hormone levels. So if thyroxine is low, then the brain stimulates the pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay? The thyroid stimulating hormone is then going to travel by the blood to the thyroid gland. And there it stimulates the thyroid gland to start producing thyroxine. Okay? And when thyroxine increases, well, that's going to increase the rate of energy. the rate of respiration, the rate of the heart rate, the blood pressure, etc. Now, on top of this, as thyroxine level increases, that's going to go into the brain, right? And that's going to give negative feedback to the brain. It's going to say, okay, there's enough of me now, enough of thyroxine, so maybe we can stop making TSH. So the brain obliges, and the brain says, okay, there's enough thyroxine, we got to decrease the amount of TSH that we're making, eventually decreasing thyroxine production. So that is the negative feedback loop, and that is quite high yield. They like to test you on this in the AQA exams. So I hope you guys are now very familiar with this. Again, decreased thyroxine stimulates the pituitary to increase TSH secretion. Increased TSH stimulates the thyroid gland to produce more thyroxine. Increased thyroxine then inhibits the secretion of TSH in the pituitary, hence the negative feedback loop. Okay, something a little bit extra here is that the thyroid gland, it uses iodine to produce thyroid hormones. Okay, do you know what iodine is? Iodine is an element that is present in group number 7. So it uses iodine to produce thyroid hormones. And normally in our diet, in the UK at least, we usually get iodine from iodized salt. Now here's a clinical correlate that I've added. This is not really mentioned in AQA. However, it is mentioned in other boards. And I wanted to mention this because it's a good knowledge to have as an educated individual. So in case a person develops severe iodine deficiency, let's say somebody living in Africa or some very third world country with not proper nutrition, then what will happen is that the thyroid gland would not have enough iodine to produce the thyroxine. This means that the thyroid gland will be hypoactive. So a person would have the opposite symptoms to these, right? They would have low appetite. They will feel tired all the time because they don't have energy. And because they're not burning calories, they will gain weight, right? And they would have cold intolerance because they're not producing a lot of body heat. The thyroid, there should be thyroid gland, may also become enlarged to try to produce as much thyroxine as it can. So it will try to become bigger to try to produce more thyroxine as much as it can with the little amount of iodine that it has. Now this condition is referred to as goiter. It's a bulge in the neck caused by an increased size of the thyroid gland. There's also another common disease. This disease is characterized by the hyperactivity of the thyroid gland. So if thyroid gland becomes hyperactive, that's going to increase the metabolic rate, increase the rate of respiration, increase the heart rate, sweating, and excessive heat production, and heat intolerance. And this is called, and it's very common, it's called Graves' disease. Okay? So again, the negative feedback loop of TSH and thyroid hormones works as follows. The pituitary gland releases TSH, which stimulates the thyroid gland to produce thyroxine. When thyroxine levels are high, they inhibit the release of TSH from the pituitary, reducing thyroxine production to maintain balance. Okay? Alright, so the next line in our discussion is going to be the pancreas. The pancreas is involved in the homeostasis of blood glucose. Do you remember what homeostasis means? Homeostasis means to regulate the internal environment of the human body. For example, the homeostasis of temperature, homeostasis of blood glucose, homeostasis of blood pressure, etc. The homeostasis of blood glucose is performed solely by the pancreas. How does that work? Well, the pancreas contains receptors that are able to detect blood glucose. So let's have a look. For any homeostasis mechanism, we start from a normal or a set point value, right? For example, normal temperature, normal blood pressure, normal blood glucose, etc. So the normal level of blood glucose actually is less than 200 milligrams on a random testing, and if you're testing for a fasting person who hasn't eaten in the past 8 hours or more, then it's supposed to be less than 100 milligrams per DL. Okay? Now let's say that the blood glucose increases more than 200. Why would it increase more than 200? Maybe somebody has a high calorie meal, right? Somebody ate a cake or a juice. Whatever it is, that has caused a change, right? A stimulus that will stimulate the receptors. So stimulus is essentially the change. In this case, the stimulus is the increase in blood sugar, which will stimulate the receptors. The receptors for blood glucose are actually present in the pancreas. The pancreas contains groups of cells called the islet cells. The islet cells are able to detect the sudden increase in blood glucose. Once they detect that there has been an increase in blood glucose, what they do is that they start releasing insulin. Okay, they secrete insulin, and that's number one. And number two, they decrease the secretion of glucagon. They decrease the secretion of glucagon. So what is the mechanism of insulin and what is the mechanism of glucagon? Let's have a look, okay? So here's what occurs. Let's make the pancreas here. So here's the pancreas. Kind of looks like this. And the pancreas consists or contains in its regions these groups of cells, okay? And these groups of cells contain cells that will secrete insulin and glucagon. Now these cells are supplied by the blood, and so they are detecting constantly, the islet cells are detecting the blood glucose. When they sense that there has been an increase in blood glucose, these cells will respond by secreting insulin, okay? So this insulin is going to go into the blood, and from the blood it's going to go to target organs, different body tissues that are going to respond to the insulin and try to decrease blood glucose. So how does that work? Well, usually insulin, it goes to a lot of cells in the body, but two very special kinds of cells that it goes to are liver and muscle cells, okay? So let's go ahead and make a liver and a muscle cell here. So here's a cell. Let's assume that this is a liver cell or a muscle cell. It has a nucleus and everything, right? And so on. Now, this is being supplied by blood vessels. So blood vessels are bringing in blood that contains glucose, of course, because we have high blood glucose. So let's say this is glucose, right? High blood glucose. And on top of this, as a result, we have released a lot of insulin. So insulin is coming in. And what the insulin is going to do is that it is going to bind to receptors on these cells, right? Liver cells and muscle cells and so on. These are going to have receptors for insulin. So insulin comes in and binds to these receptors. Once insulin binds to these receptors, now the cells know that we have to absorb glucose from the blood into the cells, okay? Absorb glucose from the blood into the cells. So how does the cell do it? Well, here's what the cell does. A cell increases glucose channels here, okay? Glucose channels. That is going to increase the absorption of glucose into the cells, right? From the blood into the cells. So as glucose moves from the blood into cells, the glucose in the blood is going to increase or decrease. Of course, it is going to decrease, right? So the blood glucose is going to decrease as a result. That's number one, right? That's mechanism number one. One thing that insulin does is that it tells muscle cells and liver cells and some other cells to take in glucose from the blood. The other thing that insulin is going to do is tell the cell to convert this into glycogen. So all of this glucose here, that's going to be converted into glycogen and be stored, okay? Remember, glycogen is the storage form of glucose in animals, especially humans. So glycogen is going to be formed as a result of stimulation from the insulin, okay? So that's mechanism number two. Both of these things will cause, together, a decrease in blood glucose. Well, what about glucagon? What does glucagon do? Let's have a look. Let's draw this in purple. Glucagon does the opposite. Glucagon causes breakdown of glycogen back to glucose, okay? Glucagon causes breakdown of glycogen back to glucose. So that's the function of glucagon. Also, I recommend that you guys practice this a little bit and not confuse the two words. They're very similar. Glycogen is the storage form of glucose. Glucagon is the hormone, okay? These are very similar words and it's easy to confuse them. Glucagon means the glycogen is gone, right? So glucagon helps in increasing blood glucose, while insulin helps in decreasing the blood glucose. So when we have high blood glucose, we increase the production of insulin while we decrease the secretion of glucagon. So what does insulin do again? It increases the absorption of blood glucose into liver and muscle cells especially, right? That's one of the things that it does. The other thing that insulin does is that it causes the absorbed glucose to be stored as glycogen, to be converted to glycogen and stored. Decreased secretion of glucagon would mean decreased breakdown of glycogen back into glucose. Of course, we're trying to make glycogen. We're not trying to break glycogen back to glucose, so there is no point in having glucagon. Another thing that glucagon does, although this is not an AQA, is that it decreases production of new glucose. Liver is able to make new glucose. Remember amino acids being broken down and converted into glucose, etc. Liver has the ability to make new glucose, and glucagon stimulates the production of new glucose. However, because you have decreased secretion of glucagon, that is going to decrease the production of new glucose. Okay? This is not an AQA, so I don't recommend that you write this as your first answer. Write this as your first answer, okay? And that is the homeostasis of blood glucose when there is an increase in blood sugar. What if the blood sugar decreases too much, right? If there's a decrease in blood sugar, well, that would be the stimulus, right? That would be the change. But what could possibly cause a decrease in blood sugar? Well, the answer to that is fasting, right? If you're fasting, that can cause exercise or not eating enough. All of those things can cause decrease in blood sugar. So, when there is a decrease in blood sugar, for example, due to not eating enough or exercising, then that is a stimulus, that is a change, and this of course will be detected by receptors, and the receptors are the islet cells in the pancreas. And what these islet cells do as a result is that they start producing glucagon this time, okay? They start secreting glucagon while decrease secretion of insulin. Increasing secretion of glucagon would mean that there is increased glycogen breakdown back into glucose. And so the blood sugar will increase. Increased production of new glucose, blood sugar will increase. And decreased secretion of insulin. Because you don't want to decrease blood sugar, you want to increase blood sugar. So decreased secretion of insulin means there's lesser absorption of glucose into cells and lesser production of glycogen. Okay? And as a result, this will increase the blood glucose, bringing it back to normal. All right? And that is the homeostasis of blood glucose. So over here in this image as well, you have the pancreas. The pancreas is producing this insulin, and insulin is going to go ahead and go to liver cells and muscle cells, and it's going to cause increased absorption of glucose into cells, increased conversion of glucose into glycogen, while glucagon's function is to do the opposite, break down the glycogen back into glucose, increasing blood sugar. Okay? Now sometimes what can happen is that we lose control over the blood glucose, and that brings us to diabetes. Diabetes is a disease that is characterized by high blood sugar levels. Okay? High blood sugar levels. Now there's two types of diabetes, type 1 and type 2, but both of them are characterized by high blood sugar levels, and therefore both of them are going to have similar symptoms. So let's have a look at some symptoms of diabetes first. Well, number one symptom is going to be increased thirst. Let me break it down for you. If you have high blood sugar levels, then the brain will think that the blood is dilute or concentrated. The blood is concentrated because it's got too much sugar in it. That's what the brain will think. So in order to dilute the blood, the brain will try to increase the thirst so that you drink more water so that the blood can become dilute. Increased thirst, it has a scientific name as well, and it is called polydipsia. You don't need to know this name for AQA, okay? But that is the symptom of high blood sugar. Another thing that occurs is increased hunger. Why? Because the glucose that you're eating is not being used, right? The cells are not receiving the glucose. It is staying in the blood. Imagine, here's a cell, right? And it's dying of hunger because it's not getting a lot of glucose. But here's a blood vessel that has abundant blood glucose. Okay, a lot of blood glucose here. But for some reason, this is not moving into the cells. So what does the cell think? The cell thinks that probably we haven't eaten enough. Even though there's abundant glucose in the blood vessel, the cell will think maybe we haven't eaten enough, right? And we need to get more glucose into our body. And so it will try to increase the hunger, okay? So increase hunger. And third is increased urination. Why is there an increased urination? That is because when there's high blood glucose, the urine also starts receiving a little bit of glucose. And so the urine also starts becoming a little bit more concentrated. And when the urine becomes concentrated, it's going to pull the water towards itself through osmosis, right? Remember, osmosis is the movement of water from high water potential to low water potential. If you have low water potential in the urine, water is going to move into the urine, right? Increasing urination. Hypertension is another symptom of diabetes. Hypertension, hyper means high, tension means stress, in this case of blood vessels, so that is high blood pressure. Kidney damage, of course, because you have this hypertension, you have this glucose, a lot of glucose in the blood vessels. You know, it's not really very healthy to have a lot of blood glucose in the blood vessels. It travels, blood vessels travel everywhere, so blood travel everywhere. And so glucose, abnormal amounts of glucose traveling everywhere in the body is going to cause damage everywhere, especially the kidneys, okay? So kidney damage is quite common to see in diabetics whose sugar is not controlled very well. Severe diabetes can also damage the nerves, right? A lot of blood glucose can also damage nerves. So when the nerves are damaged, you're not able to feel much. If you're not able to feel much, you might not even know that you're getting these injuries like ulcers and stuff. Okay? So these are the symptoms of diabetes. Now there's two types of diabetes. One of them is called diabetes type 1. Okay? In type 1 diabetes, there are damaged islet cells in the pancreas, and they cannot make insulin. Okay? Remember what the insulin does? Insulin causes the blood glucose to move into cells. So if you don't have insulin, glucose is not going to move into cells, meaning that the blood glucose remains high and the cells remain deprived of glucose. Now, this usually is present at birth or at a very young age, and it is genetically linked. Okay? The treatment for this is very simple. Remember, you don't have insulin, so what you can do is just take insulin. You start taking insulin through insulin injections or insulin pump. That should be treatment enough, right? You probably would have seen someone, at least, who has an insulin pump, maybe in your school. And then we have diabetes type 2. Diabetes type 2 is a little bit different. This occurs at old age. So when the cells of an old person becomes weary and stubborn, they stop responding to insulin. Just like older people, a little bit, they don't listen all that well. They get a little bit stubborn. Their cells also become a little bit stubborn. And so they stop listening to insulin, right? Remember, what the insulin does is that it tells the cells to take in blood glucose. And cell says, no, I'm not going to listen to you, right? I'm not going to take this blood glucose in. And so that is a problem in diabetes type 2. The cells stop responding to insulin. They say, okay, we're not going to take the blood glucose in no matter what you say. And so the blood glucose remains high. This occurs in older people. Now, the risk factors for diabetes, of course, is age, right? But also bad diet, obesity, lack of exercise, alcohol, smoking, obesity, and a little bit of genetic factors are also involved in it. Okay? So, what is the treatment of type 2 diabetes? Well, we have a diet regulation. You can control your diet, right? Try to take in sufficient amount of glucose, but not too much. Increasing exercise. What the exercise really does is that instead of relying on insulin, exercise will stimulate the cells to absorb glucose. So even though the cells are not listening to insulin, they might listen to exercise and absorb some blood glucose. Also, we have glucose lowering medications, and one of the most popular ones is called metformin, okay, also called glucophage. Pancreas transplant is curative, however, it is very risky and there is difficulty finding donors. This is for type 1 diabetes. And yeah, so that finishes our section on diabetes and on the homeostasis of blood glucose. Next up, we have the adrenaline. What is adrenaline? Of course, you guys probably are already aware of adrenaline. We have been hearing about this since we were children. Adrenaline is a hormone that is released when we are under stress. Adrenaline actually is released by something called the adrenal glands, and these are situated above the kidneys. So adrenal glands are here. It's kind of like the kidneys are wearing hats, right? So here's the kidney, quite unhappy because it's got this guy writing on it, and that's the adrenal gland. So what does the adrenal gland do? Well, one of the hormones that it produces is adrenaline, that we're going to discuss, and another thing that it produces is cortisol, and both of them are body stress hormones. So adrenaline is released to help us in extremely stressful situations. For example, there's a dog chasing us, right? And we need to run, so we need a lot of blood in our muscles. We need to see better. We need the heart rate pumping. For that, adrenaline will be released. That is called a flight situation. Flight means you want to run away. Another would be that you're trying to fight someone, right? If you're trying to fight someone, again, you need to see better, you need more blood in your muscles, you need higher energy, higher heart rate, and so that is a fight situation. And both of them are highly stressful situations. So adrenaline is released in highly stressful fight or flight situations, and it helps the body to shift its activities towards handling a threat, right? Regardless of if it is a fighting threat or a flighting situation. All right? Examples of this are here, right? You see this person surfing, diving, roller coasters, and so on. So what are the effects of adrenaline? Well, of course, more blood flow to the muscles, right? How would you get more blood flow to the muscles? The blood vessels in the muscles will dilate. We call that vasodilation in the muscles. Increased heart rate. When you increase heart rate, you pump more oxygen and glucose to muscles and the brain, increasing thinking, increasing muscle activity, and so on. Increasing respiratory rate. Remember the rate of breathing? That is going to increase. Why? For the increased oxygen demand and to remove the carbon dioxide. Pupillary dilation. Remember what muscles would dilate the pupils? The radial muscles contract while the circular muscles will relax to dilate the pupil and improve our vision. There would also be decreased rate of digestion, decreased rate of urine production. Why? Because we're in a stressful situation. We don't really care about digestion and urination when our life is in danger, right? The first and foremost priority is to get out of there alive. Once we get out of there, probably we can focus on digestion and urine production. But right now, we just want to save our lives. And that marks the end of this lecture, the first part of hormonal coordination. So if you have any questions, just let me know, and you can buy these notes by contacting through the WhatsApp link provided below. To get private coaching for your specific needs, you can contact us right now using the WhatsApp link below. And I'll see you guys in the next one, in which we will do the hormones that are involved in the human reproductive cycle.